is probably clear by this point, and probably should have been since we started discussing the 20th century, it's almost impossible to discuss Western civilization as if it's happening in isolation, as if it's not part and parcel of a global phenomenon. I mean, when the West went out in the new imperialism and tried to gobble up all elements of the world, it became fairly clear that things that happened a long way from Europe had repercussions at home. And so this second look at the Cold War that I have is really going to be another one that is episodic, but this time I want to look at episodes that are taking place around the world and how these episodes around the world are really having some very powerful ramifications for Europe. Now, a big story of the Cold War is going to be the process of decolonization. I know it's a category here, but all of this has to be seen in that. At the end of the 1800s, Europe had achieved really an unnatural level of control of areas around the globe. You have a British Empire that's global, a French Empire that's global, German empires, Russian empires, Austro-Hungarian, all of these global entities with colonial considerations throughout Europe and Africa, and they are economically dependent on them. They are dependent on them, as we saw during World War I and World War II, for resources, for manpower, for all kinds of ways to enhance their wealth and enhance their power. Well, the two wars had worked to undermine an awful lot of that power. We saw empires crumble at the end of World War I. And even World War II, though the Allies win and the British Empire comes out on top, the last of the great empires have definitely been challenged, and their hold is weakening. Indigenous people in the old colonies, in the empire, are going to work to speed that process. And so the episodes we see here are episodes around the world. There had been a lot of imperial presence in China. China itself hadn't been completely reduced to colonial state, but a lot of those Western powers had influence in China. And China's final government, the nationalist government that was led by Chiang Kai-shek during World War II, had been one that was quite corrupt. It was not generally popular amongst the people, and it had been engaged in a civil war with the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong since the mid-1920s. They had taken a bit of a break during World War II to fight the Japanese, but had immediately re-embarked on that civil war as soon as World War II was done, as soon as the Japanese were defeated. Fairly quickly, even though he had an enormous material and monetary advantage, Chiang Kai-shek lost the support of the people, lost control of his own military forces, suffered some very embarrassing defeats, and was eventually kicked off of the Asian mainland by communist forces under Mao Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek and his followers would retreat to Taiwan, and Chinese communists would consolidate the country of China, a big chunk of the Asian mainland. And they understood that the West was going to be quite hostile to them. The communism in China is different than the communism in the Soviet Union. They never get along very well. But as far as the Western democracies were concerned, they were all part of the same process, part of the same communist global conspiracy. And so China knew that they were under siege. One of the episodes of the Cold War that follows very quickly draws the Chinese in, even though it doesn't directly affect their territory. One of the areas that had been colonial before World War II was Korea. It had been a colony of Japan's, but it gains its nominal independence, its path to independence, as part of the outcome of World War II. The Allies had divided it, sort of like they did Germany, that North Korea would be under the control of the Russian communists and a government with its sponsorship under Kim Il-sung. The southern part of Korea would be under a Western influence with Syngman Rhee as its political leader, and the idea again being that they would eventually join up. In 1950, rather than join up peacefully, the North invaded the South, and this becomes a global issue when the United Nations authorizes the United States to intervene on behalf of South Korea. A multinational force, though mostly American, under the generalship of Douglas MacArthur, invaded the Korean peninsula, pushed the North Koreans back, talked about a forced reunification under South Korean leadership and democratic leadership, and scared the Chinese to the point that over 1 million Chinese troops intervene at Beijing's insistence, and the war extends for another 2 years until it fights to a stalemate, a bloody one that's basically fighting over lines on a map. But Korea finishes the war in 1953 in the same place it started it in 1950, as a divided country, and one that had pitted, again, the forces of democracy against the forces of communism. But on the other side of the globe, not a general fight in Europe. The Suez Canal, and that's what the photograph here is another decolonization issue. The Egyptians wanted the British to leave Egypt, to get out. Britain was in the process of decolonizing, and when a leader in Egypt rushed the process, a colonel by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser launched a coup to remove the last of the royal family, took over. One of his first official operations was to nationalize the Suez Canal. Now, the Suez Canal had been seen as a lifeline to the British Empire, so the loss of the Suez Canal represented a major economic blow to the British, to Great Britain. The Egyptians were also very hostile to the new Israeli nation, and Israel was looking for a buffer state, looking for really the eastern shore of the Suez Canal, the Sinai Peninsula. France also had an interest in North African stability and not allowing for these forced decolonizations. These three, the French, the British, and the Israelis, intervened to try to push Nasser back to gain the Suez Canal back from the Egyptians. The Americans pull support from this, say that they're not going to back it. The Soviets are threatening to the British and the French about the kind of repercussions that can come from this. And the upshot is the British and the French pull back. The Israelis do get the Sinai Peninsula, but essentially Egypt gets the canal and becomes an independent nation. Again, a close flashpoint in the Cold War. France is hit particularly hard during this early Cold War period. Decolonization comes to the French very powerfully in two places, in Vietnam and in Algeria. The French had suffered another stinging defeat during World War II. Their efforts to reestablish their colonial power after the war was an attempt to reestablish themselves as one of the great power nations. In Vietnam, we see an anti-colonial effort led by the Viet Cong that challenges French reestablishment of its colonial hold. I mean, the French had actually been kicked out by the Japanese. The Americans helped them to reestablish themselves, but it opens up a new war, and a war that will last until the early 1950s, when the French will suffer another humiliating defeat. The place that we associate primarily with this is the Valley of Dien Bien Phu, but the French are forced by the indigenous Vietnamese to leave their colony behind. And while there is a negotiated settlement for how Vietnam will proceed after this, essentially it's going to proceed as an independent country and not, well, two independent countries, and not as a colonial possession anymore. Same sort of thing happens with Algeria, but because the French had moved so many French citizens into Algeria, this is a longer drawn out, more painful process, and almost civil war-like in the kind of bloody confrontation that it leads to. In the end, the same situation in Algeria followed as Vietnam, and the French were kicked out. Again, their empire shrinking. The final episode that we'll take a look at is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba, an island that lies only 70 miles off the coast of Florida against the United States, had long been ruled by a dictator named Fulgencio Batista. In 1959, communist rebel Fidel Castro led a successful coup that ousted Batista and placed a communist government in charge there. The Americans worked fairly quickly to try to overthrow or to counteract that rebellion, which drove Castro into the arms of the Soviets. Castro agreed to allow the Soviets to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, and this brought about a confrontation and the final really near miss of the Cold War. The Americans wanted to remove the missile silos, the missile bases, and the missiles themselves, Rather than risk a direct military confrontation, though, the Americans opted for a blockade and put the ultimatum to the Soviets to remove the missiles and to not proceed further with this. After several very tense days of negotiations, the Soviets agreed not to place the missiles in Cuba, and the Americans, in a not quite quid pro quo, agreed to remove missiles that they had in Turkey at a later date. Also, the two superpowers agreed to establish a hotline, a direct communication, so that close calls like this could be avoided in the future. This was the last of the near-miss military encounters between the two superpowers, but the Cold War would continue on for more than 2 decades after this, as Eastern communism, Western democracy continued to face off around the globe.